we will start our story in Stockholm, on the Stockholm waterfront in the summer of 2018. I was there to attend an international conference, but I had an additional mission. Edward Kasnick, the well-known bibliographer and librarian, had alerted me to some exciting ethnographic materials on the Russian Empire in the Swedish National Museum. The main building of the museum, which you see on the slide there, was under reconstruction at the time, and the print and drawing division, which had what I was interested in, had been moved to a temporary location on a dock in the port. So my wife, the ethnographer Alisa Vovina, and I made our way down to the waterfront, which was not the picturesque city center that you see on the screen, but the working port where the cruise ships came in and out with their passengers and cargo ships loaded and unloaded their goods. And there we found a nondescript warehouse where the collection had been relocated. And after running a gauntlet of security checks, we were met by Mr. Wolfgang Nietnaus, the curator for prints and drawings. We'd been in touch beforehand, and Mr. Nietnaus knew what we wanted to see. And after settling us in the reading room, he brought out two large leather-bound volumes and set them in the stand in front of us. Now, working in archives, libraries, and museums can be quite tedious. Not only, endless letters, mundane information, terrible handwriting, and so forth. It's not often that you find something that seems really special, but this was one such moment. When we opened the volumes, we found page after page of beautiful, vivid, hand-colored ethnographic drawings of the peoples of the Russian Empire, evidently dating from the mid-18th century. And although I'm a specialist on the history of ethnography in Russia, and I have a pretty good knowledge of the existing collections, but these images were almost entirely new to me. So while we were there, Mr. Nietnaus shared with me what he knew about the collections. They show up in the museum records around 1790, 1791, when the various personal holdings of the King of Sweden were consolidated into a royal museum. They show up again in the 1860s when the Royal Museum was reconfigured into the Swedish National Museum, and the volumes were merged into the larger Tessin-Herman collection and given inventory numbers. After that, the volumes lay quietly on the shelf for another 100 years or so until they were noticed by a scholar by the name of Bjorn Hellström. Hellström was in the process of preparing a catalog of a larger collection of Russian architectural drawings. And seeing that the ethnographic drawings were associated with them, he assigned them to a young graduate student named Peter Pfab, who took on the task of transcribing the captions and producing an inventory, which is included in Hellström's catalog. So you can see Pfab's inventory is on the right on the image as the appendix. So, and it was precisely this catalog that drew the attention of Edward Kasnick and led him to the collection. So Mr. Nietnaus was kind enough to allow me to photograph the images on my iPhone. They came out actually surprisingly well, and this has allowed Mr. Kasnick and I to delve into a detailed analysis of the images and share our findings with specialists. And this fall, actually, a selection of images on Ukraine was actually displayed at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. So the volumes in Stockholm raise a number of intriguing questions. How, when, and by whom were the images collected? Who were the artists? Why were they bound in volumes like that? Who wrote the captions? How did they make their way to Stockholm? And what can scholars learn from these images? I don't have all the answers to these questions, but I'll try to give the best account I can based on the information available. So we'll start off with the most basic question. What are these images? What is the collection? So we go back to the moment when the leather-bound folio was brought out of the repository, placed on a display stand, and we had the first opportunity to open it up and see what was inside. What we found were upwards of 200 separate images mounted on the onto the pages in the folio. Uh, each image is roughly 9 inches by 6 inches in size. Most are framed with a black ink border and accompanied by a handwritten caption in German. On some of the images, there are Russian captions as well. Most of them appear to be watercolor drawings, and probably because they've been shut up for 200 years, kept closed and in the dark, the colors are bright and vibrant. The details are vivid. There is a group, though, that was actually oil paint on paper, which is rather unusual. I'll talk more about that later. So the first observation we can make looking through the images is that this is a collection from a variety of sources. It was not so much created as assembled. Several distinct artistic styles are apparent, and they correspond more or less to some fairly clearly articulated geographical divisions. And this allows us to divide the collection up into 7 more or less coherent groups. So I'll run through those groups. The first is a collection of images from the North Frisian islands of Foel and Sylt, off the coast of Schleswig-Holstein. This is approximately 15 images. And you could see from the pictures, these are very striking costumes in a kind of folk art style. I should note that these images in particular correspond quite closely to a well-known genre in European art going back to the 16th century, the genre of the costume drawing. And these were often published associated with particular nations, particular national groups. So this would seem to be in this genre. You might wonder, what is a set of drawings from near Denmark, from Schleswig-Holstein, and these islands just off the coast of Denmark? What is this doing in a collection of ethnographic images of the Russian Empire? Keep that question in mind. We'll get back to it later. It's very interesting. So the second set of images comes from the Baltic region. There are some 29 images from locations along the Baltic coast, from Latvia to Estonia and into Finland. There are 3 distinct artistic styles in this collection, captions in several different hands, but all in German. You can see the captions below. I love this image. This wedding. Not exactly what a wedding would look like now, but it's a very nice couple. So next we get to Russia proper, and we have a fascinating set of some 29 images. Sorry, my computer freezes, and then I'm trying to get back to the first image. Okay. All right, there it goes. So there are 2 distinct artistic styles in this collection. All the captions are all in a single handwriting. Several distinct themes in the Russian images. One is religious life. There is a whole series of drawings that takes the viewers basically through the sacraments of the church, from baptism to marriage to last rites and funeral, and as well as a set of portraits of Russian clerical figures. So the second set of images are historical, going back to Old Muscovy. And we see here pictures of a boyar, the streltsy, the Muscovite musketeers, and an image of a raskolnik, a Russian schismatic, if you want to get a sense of what old Russian life looks like. And then there's another set of images that take us into the everyday life of the common people. And I find these particularly fascinating. Here we see some carpenters at work. There's an image of an old Muscovite-style chancellery where a scribe is writing on a scroll without a desk. And anyone who has worked with 17th century archival documents will know these scrolls very well. There's some that take us into the life of the common people, the peasantry. Here's a water carrying yoke that you can still see in use in Russian villages to this day. There's a peasant woman with a sledge, agricultural laborer, so forth. And then there are images of urban life as well, townspeople. And this is the second artistic style that I mentioned. You can see it's actually quite different, and we have some possible guesses or theories as to who the artist might be in this one, but none I would venture to formalize yet. Uh, so these are the Russian pictures. The next set of images are a small set of images of the Georgian nobility. There are 7 of these images in all, but the detail in these is just astonishing. These very beautiful images, finely crafted details, really very, very striking. It's interesting because Georgia, of course, was not part of the Russian Empire at this time. So what are Georgians doing in this collection? Don't have an answer for that yet. Perhaps they were simply brought from Georgia through diplomatic relations. Perhaps these were Georgian nobles who were in the Russian Empire. Note as well that these have the Russian language captions as well. And they're only identified as Georgian in the German captions. So that's interesting. All right, the next set of images takes us into the Volga Kama region and then into Siberia. There are 36 images in all, in a consistent artistic style, somewhat similar to the Russian images that we saw. Captions are in a single hand, usually single subjects, representing a distinct ethnic group. Each ethnic group is identified by name. The figures are shown in national dress with characteristic headgear, sometimes objects of everyday life, and dwellings, showing something about the lifestyle of these different peoples. Here are some Siberian peoples, for example, and you can see, for example, reindeer herding people, nomadic people are often shown with their reindeers in the background. The picture of a Samoyed, and sometimes show warlike people shown with weapons as well. And there's a collection of images of Siberian shaman from different groups. There are Buryat shaman, Mongolian shaman, Tungus shaman, all with their characteristic, the bubny, the drums that the shaman beat as they go into their trances. So I will speak more about these images for a while. Another set of images takes us to the region of Astrakhan on the mouth of the Caspian Sea. And these are very different from the other images in their artistic style. A folk art style almost seems somewhat more, I don't know, dare I say it, Eastern Oriental in its style. Captions are written in Russian with German translation or a German caption below. The Russian orthography tends to place this in the first half of the 18th century, in the period following the orthographic reforms of Peter the Great, but not too far, when the orthographic reforms hadn't sunk in too deeply. So the drawings show us, well, first of all, Astrakhan was a very cosmopolitan, multicultural area, with many people moving in and out. We see nomadic peoples from the steppes. The Nogais were referred to as Yurtove Tatari, Kalmyks. I love these, the Kalmyk woman with her musical instrument, and then it also shows a number of pictures of traders, people who came to Astrakhan to trade, Greek merchants, Persian. Here are 2 Kazakhs with Kazakhs coming from time to time to trade. The caption says there are also Hindus and Turks and various other peoples who would have appeared in Astrakhan. So, and then finally we get to our Ukrainian images. And these are very different in execution. They're painted in oil paints on paper, which means a number of them initially were in very poor shape Paint is flaking, although the colors still remain bright and vivid. The images that I'm showing here actually have been touched up because these are the images we showed at the Hermann Institute. So the original images had a lot more flaking, so forth. But these images give us a wide panorama of Ukrainian society, from the nobility to townspeople, to ordinary peasants, to beggars, and different ethnic groups in Ukraine. And I'll talk more about that later. So overall, it's an extraordinary collection of images, and all the more so since these images have never been published. And as far as we know, they were rarely seen, if at all, for the last 200 years. I'd like to focus in particular on two areas of the collection to give you a sense of its significance. First, the images of the Volga region and Siberia, and secondly, the images of Ukraine. So if we look at the images depicted of the Volga region and Siberia, you can see they kind of come in a sequence that take you from east to west, starting in the Volga region, and then moving across the Ural Mountains into Western Siberia, and then the kind of area where later the Trans-Siberian passed through cities like Krasnoyarsk, Novosibirsk, up the Yenisei River to the settlement that was known as Mangazia. It's now Turutarkansk, I believe. And then further down to the Lake Baikal region, Transbaikalia, Buryats, and then back again up to Yakutia. So that's kind of the path of the images we see in the collection. Looking at this path, a striking parallel immediately comes to mind, or at least it came to my mind. This is almost exactly the path taken by one of the most important scientific expeditions of the 18th century, the Second Kamchatka expedition that ran from 1733 to roughly 1740. Here's the path of the Second Kamchatka expedition, and you can see almost the same route, starting from the Volga region over the Ural Mountains, across Western Siberia, up the Yenisei River, to the Lake Baikal region, Transbaikalia, and then up to Yakutsk. Almost the same route. The expedition was led by the historian Gerhard Friedrich Müller and the naturalist Johann Gottfried Melin, involved as many as 500 people. It was a huge undertaking, from world-class astronomers, geologists, cartographers, botanists, to an army of translators, porters, hunters, Cossacks, guides, just a huge number of people, and it was very generously funded at the time. Within this delegation were 3 specially trained artists who had received detailed training instructions in St. Petersburg on how to depict Siberian peoples, their costumes, dwellings, and objects of everyday life. The Academy brought back, or the expedition brought back to the Academy, a mass of artifacts and materials, including presumably drawings. But there's a problem. No one has been able to find these drawings. They've disappeared. Scholars have scoured the Russian archives, the archives of the Academy of Sciences. They're just not there. Apparently, there was a major fire in the Museum of the Academy of Sciences, the Kunstkamera, in 1747 that destroyed much of the material from the expedition, and it was long thought that the drawings and paintings from the expedition had been destroyed. But the parallels between the locations mentioned in the Stockholm collection and the route of the expedition suggests an intriguing possibility. Could it be that the images in the Stockholm collection represent at least some of the missing visual materials from the Second Kamchatka expedition? Our further resource suggests that this is almost certainly the case. With the help of colleagues in Europe, Hans Vermeulen and Willig Hinzschick, in Halle, Germany, we have arrived at what we consider to be conclusive evidence. The key link in this connection is Gerhard Friedrich Müller. In late 1734, in the early stages of the expedition, Müller reported sending a package. He sent an inventory and listed 8 drawings. Going to the Academy of Sciences, the 8 drawings were of women's costumes of the peoples of the Middle Volga region. The same depictions of the same women's costumes of the same people are listed in the same order in the inventory of the Stockholm drawings. Müller's correspondence shows that he was working at the time on a book describing the Christian peoples of the Middle Volga region. And it was based on his first year of research on the expedition. The book wasn't actually published in full and in Russian until after Müller's death in 1790. But there at the end of the book are the 8 images of the women's costumes, the women in their costumes, just as they are described in the 1734 inventory. And these are exactly the same images that appear in the Stockholm collection. So here you can see in this slide, on the left-hand side is the image from the Stockholm collection, and the engraving in the middle is the image published in Müller's 1790 volume. You can see it's the same image, just a different copy, and of course in a different medium. The Siberian image, the Stockholm image is a watercolor. Müller's image is an engraving. So, okay, so that establishes pretty firmly that the first 8 images of the Volga women costumes in the Berchtold collection, the Stockholm collection, were created no later than 1734 and arose out of the Second Kamchatka expedition. What about the rest of the Siberian images? In September 1746, Müller submitted another set of 28 drawings to the Academy of Sciences. They're listed as illustrations for and then titled Description of Peoples. We know that Müller had written a manuscript entitled Description of Siberian Peoples, which he had hoped to publish but was unable to due to the unfavorable political atmosphere in the Academy of Sciences. Evidently, the drawings in the 1746 inventory were intended as illustrations for this work. All of these drawings, judging by the descriptions, also appear in the inventory of the Stockholm collection in largely the same order. And you can see here, this is a listing on the left hand of Müller's inventory from 1746. And this is from the inventory of images in the collection in Stockholm. And you could see it is the same images. The wording is somewhat different in the German, but it come almost identical in terms of the identification of the images. You know, here number 9, you have ein Buchar zu Tobolsk, a Buchar in Tobolsk, and then here you have Tobolsk Buchar. So slightly different wording, but it's clearly the same images being described. There's another piece of evidence that comes from Müller himself. So, perhaps the best known ethnographic work to arise in the 18th century was Johann Gottlieb Georgi's Description of the Peoples of Russia, published first in German in 1776 and in Russian a few years later. The ethnographic descriptions were accompanied by a large number of images, hand-tinted engravings, which have become iconic representations of the peoples depicted. You see them repeated over and over again. These images were produced by an engraver by the name of Christopher Roth, who had worked for 10 years in the Academy of Sciences. Now, Roth was not an exact copyist, but some 17 of Roth's images bear an unmistakable resemblance to images in the Stockholm collection. Here are 2. Here's our Chertomis woman with the interesting hat. And here it is on the left in the Georgi collection, and then down on the right in the Stockholm collection. And then here's our Buchar from Tobolsk in the Stockholm collection, and then there he is on the top right as he appears in the Georgi collection. Now, it's a different execution, but clearly related images. So Müller himself attests to this connection in an account of In his account of the expedition, which he wrote late in life, Mueller tells of an incident in which an old Siberian shaman purported to pierce his torso from side to side with an arrow. Mueller looked into it, got the old man to tell him what the secret was, and then he brought in one of the artists to record the scene. He wrote, "I had it drawn, and the figure can be found in the pictures accompanying Mr. Georgi's description of the peoples of Russia. The copper engraver Roth has obtained my drawings, I don't know how, from the Academy." So, and this same image is found in the Stockholm collection. So here you see on the left is how it appears in the Georgi collection, and then further down is the image in the Stockholm collection. So yeah. So now, if Roth did attain Mueller's images through the Academy of Sciences, it does not appear that he actually returned them to the Academy. There's some evidence, it's too complicated to go into now, but there's some evidence that a few artists and engravers may have had access to the Siberian images prior to the 1770s. We see some parallel images showing up in engravings by one French artist in particular. Le Prince was in Russia for a few years, and we see some of these images, parallel images showing up in his engravings. But after the Georgi volume is published, the path goes cold. These images do not show up again. One theory possibly is that engravers at the time tended to look at watercolors, drawings, simply as their raw materials. The engraving was the permanent record that could be reproduced. The drawings were simply material for the engraving, so they didn't place too much attention to it, and he may have misplaced them or thrown them out or burned them or who knows what. But they don't seem to have made it back to the Academy of Sciences. So, and that suggests that the images in Stockholm may be the only surviving illustrations from the Second Kamchatka expedition. So, okay, I want to talk now about the Ukrainian collection. And these are also linked to an expedition, but of a rather different kind. Um, in the summer of 1744, the entire court of the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna set out on a massive journey expedition. It was dubbed a pilgrimage to the holy sites of Kiev. Elizaveta, actually, despite her frivolous reputation, was actually well known for her piety as well. So it was a religious exercise. But above and beyond the religious motivations, there was a political agenda at work as well. The voyage was arranged by Elizabeth's lover and unofficial consort, Count Alexei Razumovsky. Razumovsky had been born a Ukrainian Cossack, and he had rose to prominence when a traveling dignitary from St. Petersburg had heard him singing in the local church, and he was immediately recruited for the Imperial Capella in St. Petersburg. There, he was noticed by Elizabeth, who was not yet in power. Elizabeth was enchanted by his beautiful voice and his stunning good looks, and the rest, as they say, is history. But even as Razumovsky became a fixture in the imperial elite, and he had a significant hand in the coup d'etat that brought Elizabeth to power, but he never forgot his homeland. In particular, Razumovsky wanted to restore the autonomous institutions of the Ukrainian hetmanate, which had fallen into disarray. A hetman had not been appointed since the 1730s. The post was vacant, and the hetman was gradually being absorbed in hetmanate, was gradually being absorbed into the Russian Empire. So a trip to Ukraine would be an ideal occasion to make his case to Elizabeth and share with her his love for his native language. So, okay, what does this have to do with these images of Ukrainians that we see in Stockholm? Here, we don't really have the same kind of smoking gun that we have with the Siberian images, but there is still a fairly firm connection. Unlike the Siberian images, the Ukrainian images are not identified by location. But the people depicted are quite consistent with the area to which the court traveled. Uh, when not visiting Kiev itself, Elizabeth and her entourage spent most of their time in Razumovsky's hometown of Kozelets, which is some 80 miles or so northeast of Kiev. There is a connection between the people shown in the expedition and the regions of Ukraine to which the court trip went. So the trip was based at Razumovsky's estate at a place called Kozelets, very near to a town called Nezhin, which had a large settlement of Greek merchants. And here we see the Greek merchants. Very, very distinctively there. They were also very close to the region of Polessia in the north of Ukraine, which had an ethnic group called the Litvins. We see them as well. So the content of the collection places us in the general area that the court expedition went to. But a little closer, we have to look a little bit at who is actually on this expedition, along with Elizabeth and her entourage. It seems that alongside the main delegation of Elizabeth and his courtiers, there was a second group that had gone ahead so as to avoid all the official events, receptions, prayer services, parades, etc., that slowed the progress of the main group down to a glacial pace. This faster group, which reached Kozelets full 2 weeks before the main group, consisted of these are some images of the Ukrainian collection. So you can see the Ukrainian nobility, townspeople, all of these details of costumes meticulously recorded, manorial peasants, and even Roma, who would have been in a trading city like Nizhin. So there's the young court went ahead. The young court consisted of the heir to the throne, Elizabeth's nephew, Pyotr Fyodorovich, or Karl Peter Ulrich von Schleswig-Holstein, as he liked to be called, the future Emperor Peter III, and along with him was his fiancée, recently arrived from the German Principality of Anhalt-Zerbst, Princess Sophia Augusta Friederike, the future Empress Catherine the Great. Of course, the young folks were not left on their own. They were accompanied by a host of retainers and minders, including the princess's meddlesome mother and Peter's tutors, Otto von Brummer and Friedrich Wilhelm Bergholz, who, since the young prince's parents had both died, had been given primary responsibility for his upbringing. In her memoirs, Catherine provides a humorous account of the journey, juxtaposing the tedium and discomfort of the travel with the high spirits of the young people who had a grand time poking fun at the old folks, especially Peter's tutors. But it's precisely these tutors, Bergholz in particular, who we posit was key to the creation of the Stockholm images. So much so that we generally refer to it as the Bergholz collection. Bergholz was a German nobleman from the Duchy of Schleswig-Holstein. From his early years, his fate had been tied to Russia. He had traveled to Russia as a boy with his father and lived there for several years while his father served in Peter the Great's army. After his return, he was appointed to serve in the Duke's court, and in 1721, he returned to St. Petersburg to serve in the Duke's entourage. The Duke of Schleswig-Holstein, that is, extended his stay and eventually married Peter the Great's eldest daughter, Anna. And so after Peter's death, the Duke and the Duchess now, Anna Petrovna, stayed in Russia until 1727 when they were forced to leave. Apparently, a political intrigue orchestrated by Menshikov. It was during these years that Bergholz made the acquaintance of Count Otto von Brummer, a nobleman from Estonia with close connections in both the Russian and Swedish courts. And the path of these two men would remain closely linked for the rest of their lives. Both returned to Holstein with the Duke and attained high positions in the Holstein court. The following year, in 1729, Princess Anna Petrovna gave birth to a son, christened Karl Peter Ulrich, the future Emperor of Russia, Peter III. But this joyful occasion was clouded with tragedy. Soon after the birth, Anna Petrovna was taken ill, almost certainly childbed fever, and died. Um, the Duke of Holstein died 10 years later, and responsibility for the education and upbringing of his young son was entrusted to Count Brumer and his companion Bergholz. By all accounts, the two men had little to offer in the way of pedagogical skill. Brumer, in particular, was known for his brutality and crude manners. He was, frequently beat his young student, forced him to kneel on peas when he said his lessons wrong, all over a kind of nightmarish teacher. And you can imagine the kind of resentments that boiled up in the young students over his tutor. But whatever Brumer and Bergholz's shortcomings as pedagogues, it didn't seem to impede the advancement of their career. And when in 1749, young Karl Peter's aunt, Elisaveta Petrovna, summoned the boy to Russia to take his place as her designated successor, Brumer and Bergholz accompanied him as part of his entourage. Upon their arrival, the two were reappointed by Elizabeth to oversee the boy's education. The two men were richly rewarded upon the boy's conversion to Orthodoxy. This was an important moment because it rendered him ineligible to inherit the Swedish throne, to which he also had a claim. And after that, he became known as the Grand Duke Pyotr Fyodorovich, so becomes Russified in a sense, although he never did really fully learn the Russian language. Brumer also played a key role in arranging the Grand Duke's betrothal to Princess Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst, the future Catherine the Great. But Peter's marriage kind of marked the beginning of the end for Brumer and Bergholz. Once he was married in 1746, he was basically gave him greater freedom to conduct his own affairs. Resentments that had built up over years of ill treatment burst out into the open. Peter treated his tutors with increasing disdain. And finally, after the wedding, Peter summed up his courage to inform his tutors that their services were no longer required. The two might have stayed in Russia and found other jobs had it not been for Brumer's penchant for intrigue. He had become associated with a court faction, including the doctor Johann Hermann Listock, Count Michael Vorontsov, and Catherine's mother, Johanna. And this faction sought to undermine the position of the Chancellor Bestuzhev-Rumen, and Bestuzhev-Rumen got the upper hand in the struggle. Using intercepted correspondence, he was able to show that Brumer and his allies were on the payroll of the Russian and French and Prussian courts, acting in their interests. Bergholz himself was in the background of these intrigues. His name doesn't figure in the participants in the conspiracy, but as Brumer's closest associate, he was held accountable. And in May of 1746, the two were arrested, interrogated, and expelled from Russia. Brumer and Bergholz settled in the town of Bismarck in Pomerania, which at the time was part of Sweden. Initially, they had been granted a Swedish pension by Elizabeth, but in 1748, the pension was discontinued. And the following year, the two successfully appealed to the Swedish court for financial support. This would appear to have provided an opportune moment for Bergholz to have passed on to the Swedish court valuable materials in his possession. This would have included not only his ethnographic costume drawings, but also an extraordinary collection of architectural plans and drawings, showing in detail the physical layout of St. Petersburg, houses along its main streets, with additional drawings of Moscow and Kiev. But how do we know it was actually Bergholz who collected and transmitted these materials? Unfortunately, documentary sources to directly confirm this supposition are lacking, but the circumstantial evidence is very strong. First and foremost, Bjorn Hallström compared the handwriting on the captions of the architectural drawings to known letters of Bergholz and established that the hand was the same. And the captions on the ethnographic drawings appear to be in the same hand. And here are two examples of the handwriting, one from the architectural drawing, one from the ethnographic drawings. Further evidence of a connection to Bergholz is a reference in one of the captions to Count Brumer. It's a little bit odd. It's a picture of a young Tungus from near Yakutsk, and it says in German, who had been sent to Russia to Count von Brumer as a present. And there are some accounts of small groups of native Siberians being sent to St. Petersburg from the exhibition. So maybe there's something to that. But this establishes a connection with Brumer, who is Bergholz's closest connection. There's also a cryptic reference in the Astrakhan drawings to the year 1746, which puts us in the right time range. There's also those images from those islands off Schleswig-Holstein, Fohl and Sir, which are suggestive, creates a direct connection to Schleswig-Holstein, which is, of course, Peter III was also the Duke of Schleswig-Holstein and took those responsibilities very, very seriously, and as was Brumer and Bergholz. So we should also note that Bergholz had the means to produce such an album. His position as tutor to the Grand Duke gave him full access to materials of the Academy of Sciences. And if there was anything he couldn't get himself, he could get it through his colleague, Jakob von Stehlen, who was secretary to the Academy. It's likely this was how Bergholz attained the material from the Second Kamchatka expedition. The images in the collections are likely copies of originals that had been lost. Bergholz probably attained the originals through Stehlen, made copies, returned them through Stehlen to Müller, who sent them back to the Academy where they were listed on his inventory. The originals were then lost or destroyed by Roth when he copied them for Georgi's volume. These pieces of circumstantial evidence, plus the fact that the ethnographic albums in Sweden are grouped together with Bergholz's architectural drawings, and that no plausible evidence has emerged to support an alternative narrative, suggests that Bergholz was almost certainly the source from which the Swedish court attained the ethnographic images. So if we accept that the materials came from Bergholz, the question remains, why, when, and how did Bergholz assemble these images? It is likely that Bergholz took them out of Russia as a kind of insurance policy, knowing that they would be valuable to whatever country he wound up in, and particularly Sweden. In fact, taking these materials from Russia and providing them to a foreign power may well have been a treasonous act. Information about the Russian Empire was highly restricted at the time. Even ethnographic descriptions of Siberian peoples were considered a state secret, as Müller found out. House-by-house city plans, such as the one Bergholz turned over to the Swedes, were of clear strategic significance, especially if you were planning an invasion, which the Swedes were actually. But these were these were not materials that Bergholz could have assembled at the spur of the moment. It must have taken a good deal of time and effort to put all of this together. It was more likely that Bergholz collected these materials over an extended period of time, which brings us to another possibility, that these materials may have been connected to Bergholz's main occupation in Russia, teaching the Grand Duke Peter. Bergholz and Brumer didn't leave much evidence of their pedagogical methods, but there's another source that's quite revealing. There was this third tutor appointed when the Grand Duke got to Russia, Jakob von Stehlen, who I've already mentioned, professor of rhetoric, history, and art in the Academy of Sciences. Stehlen left a vivid description in his memoir of what it was like to teach the young Grand Duke. Peter, we learned, was not quite the imbecile that his ex-wife Catherine made him out to be in his memoirs, but book learning was clearly not his strong point. Holding the attention of the young Grand Duke was a perpetual struggle for the tutors. The slightest thing could distract him. The tutors were obliged to devise various methods to keep him on task. Use of visual material was particularly prominent. Stillen writes, in the evenings, when the Grand Duke wasn't called to the Empress or court reception, the tutor entertained him with large volumes from the Academy Library, especially those which contained didactic illustrations, as well as various mathematical and physical tools and models from the Kunstkamera, along with samples from the three realms of the natural world. Stillen also described a classified large format volume entitled The Forces of the Empire, showing illustrations of all the fortifications belonging to the Russian state from Riga to the Turkish, Persian, and Chinese borders. A similar volume showing the peoples of the empire, the Grand Duke's future subjects, and including the people of Schleswig-Holstein, would be entirely consistent with this pedagogical approach and quite necessary. Would seem a future emperor should know something about the people he would rule. And Peter at the time seemed to have nothing but disdain for his future subjects. We know as well that the tutors would have had direct access to any materials available through the Academy of Sciences and any other institution. Stalin reports that the Empress had given the order once and for all to issue to the Grand Duke anything necessary for his instructions. The inclusion of a large collection of ethnographic images would fit this model as well. And they would have the additional benefit of reminding the Grand Duke of places he had been and people he had seen. Hellstrom and more recent Russian scholars have suggested that the architectural drawings assembled by Bergholz may have played a similar role. All of this leads us to the conclusion that in all likelihood, these materials were gathered originally for pedagogical purposes by the tutors of the Grand Duke, and that they wound up in the possession of Bergholz at the time of his expulsion from Russia, and that in some manner he was able to get them out of the country and present them to the Swedish court, possibly as one of the services for which he received a pension. So I will leave it at that.
We received a couple, actually, a bit more interesting questions. And when you mentioned the secrecy in the Russian Empire, a couple of people wondered why the Russian Empire was so secretive about any visual materials or any other materials leaking abroad. What was it? What was it
Hmm,
about?
hmm. That's a good question. I know that certainly spies were everywhere in the court of Elizabeth. There was an enormous amount of intrigue and manipulation, and war was a continual process. In fact, the Russians went to war with Sweden in the early 1740s. I think it was around 1743, 1744. So certainly, street clans could potentially have military purposes, but I'd almost like yeah, I think it's deeper than that, and it's hard to explain. I don't have a ready-made answer, but you see the same thing in Muscovite Russia, for example. This very strong distrust of foreigners, this unwillingness to share information. Travelers to Muscovy uh, write about this in many different travel accounts. All the difficulty they had getting out of the kind of bubble that was created for them by their handlers in the Muscovite court, and there's a sense that this continued as well into the 18th century, into the reign of Peter the Great. Of course, it's contradictory because at the same time that there's this secrecy, the Russian authorities and the Academy of Sciences are also inviting eminent European scientists to come to Russia, to study Russia, to build their careers there. People like Mueller and a number of others. They're actually in some of the earliest ethnographers of Siberia and the Russian Empire actually prisoners of war in the war with Sweden under Peter the Great, who produced ethnographies of Siberia and so forth. So it's a little bit of a contradictory picture, but it does seem that this kind of knee-jerk secrecy was still a factor in Russia at the time and remains so. Uh, so,
Yeah, very true that it's probably still the case.
oh yeah, yeah, it is.
There is another great question from Douglas Faulkner. Were there any other similar expeditions in Russia after those you discussed in your lecture?
Yes, there was another set of major expeditions in the reign of Catherine the Great in the 1760s and 1770s. Peter Palas was the leader of them, but it was a complex expedition with a number of participants, uh, quite a few actually. And as with the second Kamchatka expedition, it was a kind of complex expedition that combined the natural sciences, everything from botany, geology, um, physical geography involving astronomy, observations of the stars for cartographic purposes, as well as ethnographic observations, linguistic observations, um, you know, studies of the natural resources of different areas, and this produced a wealth of publications. So, and there are some smaller expeditions that were carried out as well, in various periods. But these two, the second Kamchatka expedition and the Palas expedition of the 1760s and 70s, are probably the two really big ones. Uh, After the Palas expedition, the activity kind of dies down into the 18th century.
We got a message from Russell Martin. It's our
Oh,
former second Saturday lecture speaker. You probably know Russell. Uh,
yeah.
this is a remarkable work of historical detective work. Do
Mhm.
the textual captions contain any surprises, particularly the terminology for peoples, places, and occupations?
Uh, yes, there were some interesting usages. Most of the Siberian terminology tended to use follow the Russian usage, so nothing too surprising there. Um, for the Ukrainian terminology, I mean, and I think this is sort of relevant to contemporary discussions and versions of history that we've been hearing quite recently from, the term Ukrainian is used consistently throughout Ukrainische in German to designate the Ukrainian people. There is an acknowledgement of this other term, which was widely used at the time and continued to be used into the 20th century. Little Russians, Malorossianie, and some people will say that that's all that was used, and they didn't use this term Ukrainian at all. But Berkholz acknowledges. He said, uh, Kleinrussische, Little Russians, or he says Ukrainische oder Kleinrussische, Ukrainians or Little Russians. So he acknowledges that the term exists, but continually and persistently uses the term Ukrainian, and this is suggestive as well. There are some mysteries. For example, there's a wonderful image from the Ukrainian collection of a man, with a mustache holding a kind of canteen and holding out a glass of some beverage. It kind of looks like an IPA or something like that, but he's identified as a Mukan. And we've been scratching our, what is a Mukan? Who is a Mukan? It's an ethnic group. I haven't find anything. I think we may have hit upon it, that it was an Arabic word that was used in the Ottoman Empire to designate servant. And so that this would have been a servant, perhaps for one of these merchants who acted as intermediaries between the Russian world and the Ottoman world, and were able to pass that back. That's why these Greeks were so important, because they had an Ottoman citizenship. They based out of Crimea, but yet they were able to pass into Russia. The way Russians would not necessarily be able to pass into the Ottoman territories, and Turks as well. So that was, we find these mysteries as well. So, but that's a great question.
The last question we have time for today comes from Maxim Motusevich.
Ah,
There must have been an interesting dynamic between what seems to be the majority of ethnographic researchers who were of German or Baltic extraction, or the ethnic Russian scholars. Were there any enduring tensions between the two groups that endured into the 19th century? Any difference in their methodological approaches and the conclusions they reach about the empire's ethnic diversity?
that is an interesting question, because the expedition was dominated by German scholars, but there were Russians as well. Most famous was Stepan Krasheninnikov, who wrote a very important 4-volume work on Kamchatka, based on his visits to Kamchatka as part of this expedition. and and he worked closely with Miller and another German scholar as well on the trip, they and I don't get the sense that there was direct tension and confrontation between someone like Krasheninnikov and Mueller. They were on the same page. They were working together. They had a common sense of purpose. Um, but there was tension between Mueller and other German scholars and other scholars in the Academy of Sciences, and particularly historians, because Mueller was a historian, and he put forward a version of history based on the chronicles that were just being discovered at the same time, so which gave credence to the Varangian theory, the theory that it was basically Vikings who had settled in Russia and had formed the first government of the earliest Russian state, Rus. And this rubbed Russian scholars the wrong way, very much so. Especially the famous Lomonosov, the great scientist and polymath, who also fancied himself a historian. And there was some very, very ugly polemics that take root during the 1750s between Lomonosov and others in the Academy of Science and Mueller. And this issue continues to percolate. So the tensions between German scholars and Russian scholars were very real. And they continued on well into the 18th century. It's something I talk about in the context of the Russian Geographical Society in the mid-19th century, and even further than that. So yes, there were, but the ethnographers basically got along. When they were out there in the field, they had a common sense of purpose, a common sense of methodology. So it wasn't really a problem.